Well, I want to welcome everybody, and we appreciate everyone taking a little time during their lunch hour to spend with us. My name is Dorothy Alter. I'm the Executive Director for California Indian Legal Services. And the purpose of this webinar is to focus in on some of the best practices as we move into broadband and the expansion of broadband in Indian country. And some of the thoughts that we had going into this were, as many of you may know, that when there's a lot of money being poured into Indian country, that we oftentimes then see a lot of first-time experts on the particular project or subject matter that is being funded. And I myself have been around long enough to see this happen with gaming. We saw this happen with cannabis. And my fear was that we may be seeing this with broadband. And so what we are going to try and do today is we have pulled together some of the experts in this area who are volunteering their time to share with us what some of the things to be aware of. And we'll have questions that hopefully we can all answer as we move through the PowerPoint. And we're also hoping that if there's a strong interest that we might actually have a series of additional webinars on more specific issues. So we're hoping to get some good feedback from you. If you want, why don't we go to the next slide, and I'll just do a brief overview of what CILS is about. Many of you probably already know that we are a nonprofit Indian legal services program. We've been around for over 50 years. Our mission is to advance Indian rights and foster self-determination and facilitate tribal nation building. And as I touched on before, we have worked in the areas of Indian child welfare and also providing educational materials to people, protection through doing Indian wills involving trust land, protecting cultural resources. We've also dealt with taxation, and we also do a lot of work with strengthening governance, working directly with tribes and building tribal courts and tribal law enforcement. And this webinar is really an extension of that, in that we really want to make sure that tribes that are interested in broadband have the right tools, the right information, and are given, a good, sound, base in order to evaluate consultants who are going to be reaching out to you, and what's the best method for your particular tribe in bringing broadband to your reservation. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and let our speakers speak to their expertise and who they're representing today. Dave?
Yes, thank you, Dorothy, and thanks to your entire team for hosting this program on such a timely topic. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here and to share some of our experience. I came to, for those who are in the audience, I came to know Dorothy and her team over some of the work that we were doing with tribes during the pandemic response. And Dorothy and I were talking about some of the things that we're concerned about, as she mentioned in her introductory remark. And we thought this was a really good idea to flag some of the best and some of the worst practices that we have seen around contracting and procurement for broadband systems and services. The experience that our organization brings, I serve as the Chief Executive Officer of a nonprofit. We're called Geeks Without Frontiers. We are focused on broadband systems, services, business models, regulation, policy, legal matters, essentially everything that relates to the acquisition and the deployment and operation of sustainable broadband networks. We work together collaboratively with organizations like CILS, with local communities around the world. Most of these communities are in challenging operational environments, refugees in refugee camps, disaster-affected populations who have just endured hurricanes, earthquakes, tsunamis, and other natural calamities, as well as conflict countries where there may be political or geopolitical dynamics in play, and low-income communities, rural areas, people who are marginalized for whatever reason. That's where we spend most of our time. Before the pandemic, frankly, we were not working with tribes in North America. We were spending most of our time overseas in developing countries. There were tribes there too, different type of tribes, Aborigines, other indigenous peoples throughout Africa and South America and elsewhere. But during the pandemic, we were asked whether we could provide and share experience on broadband network deployments here for the tribes, and have been doing so now for approximately 1 year. And it's been a privilege to assist us. One of our go-tos in working with communities, when we find special needs that community has associated with what their aspirations are for broadband, we reach out to partners. CILS has been an amazing resource, and the tribal community of California is extremely fortunate to have them holding, guarding their back. In addition, we have the privilege to work with other partners in California with tribes. And one of those partners, literally a few minutes before this webinar began, there was a health crisis in their family, and they had to be called away. That was Lisa Hanlon, who serves as the chief executive for the Teltec Group. She is herself a member of the tribal community here in North America, and she sends her apologies as well as an expression of her availability to answer follow-on questions that anyone in the audience today may have after the webinar. So she will be available to share her expertise as well. Let me just say too that Geeks Without Frontiers, as a global nonprofit, is also technology neutral. What do I mean by that? It means that we are not aligned or have any special interest at all on any types of technology. So we are completely unbiased in the advice and the consultancy that we provide for the communities that we work with. And that's going to be really important during the period that is gearing up right now, where there's going to be a lot of funds. We'll be talking about that in a moment, and where there's a lot of need for contracting, decision-making on which types of systems make the most sense for specific types of networks to address tribal priorities. Before I go on too long, I'd like to introduce another of our partners, and that is Gil Karlin. She is a partner with BBK. And Gil, if you could say a few words about your background and that of your firm as well.
Sure. Thank you, David, and thank you, Dorothy. I echo David's appreciation of you organizing this event and giving us the opportunity for education here. I think it's going to be, we hope it will be really valuable. My name is Gil Karlin. I am a partner in the law firm of Best and Krieger, or BBK. It's a 130-year-old California law firm. We have offices in a number of cities. We also have some offices outside of the state, most notably in Washington, D.C., where we do a lot of telecommunications work. My practice is exclusively in telecommunications. I've been practicing in that area for more than 20 years. And at Best and Krieger, our group that works in telecommunications law works, and our firm itself, primarily with public agencies, local governments, with different sorts of water districts. And so we're very sensitive to and understand promoting community interest and ensuring that in contracting and in dealing with the private sector in telecommunications contracts, that we achieve the community's goals. That's always our focus. And we recognize also that this is an area that can have a lot of complexity and is not, so it can easily kind of get lost in the jargon of the industry. And I personally have a lot of experience where sometimes the agreements that you're presented don't seem to match up with the promises that are being made in conversation. So that's really what I bring to the table, is that expertise in reviewing and negotiating these sorts of complex technology agreements, and with an eye to protecting the community's interests. So I'm really thrilled to be here today to help share some of my experience and my knowledge. So
thank you. Just a couple of housekeeping. Throughout the presentation, if you have a question, you can put it in the chat, and Mike Godby, who's the staff attorney from our Bishop CILS office, will be manning the chat, and we will go ahead and take questions during the presentation. So feel free, if there's a slide that you have questions or confused about, by all means raise your hand and submit your question. We'll also provide questions at the end if time permits. So again, we really want to encourage people. We'd like to make this interactive. I may myself comment on a slide or two, and so we hope to hear from you. So let's get started. Dave, you want to start with your slideshow presentation?
Sure thing. Thanks, Dorothy. So setting the stage, there is a tremendous need worldwide, but especially for tribal communities here in the state of California. It has been shown again and again, and I'm sure this will come as no surprise, that tribal communities disproportionately and chronically lack access to broadband and the solutions that flow through broadband networks. This is communications networks. The problem, which was acute before the pandemic, has become even more so during the pandemic. Early on in the pandemic, as everyone here will know too well, health issues compounded many of the challenges that were facing tribes that might otherwise have been resolved or mitigated by access to broadband networks. And we're talking specifically about need for access to health services. Suddenly people were unable to get out in public to clinics, so they needed remote access, ideally from their homes. That's feasible. That's something that's available today through telehealth type services that can flow through a broadband network. Education. Children were kept at home, teachers unable to get into classrooms because typically there was not access to remote or distance learning. Again, something that can and often does flow through broadband networks for those who have them. Other services, vital services, were out of reach for tribal communities. Getting to the workplace became a challenge, and having a remote work capability was something that became excruciatingly important. and a wide range of other vital services. I would go so far as to say almost every form of human endeavor depends on and can be influenced positively or negatively on whether or not community members have access to broadband services. So it's not just that simple whether or not you have it. Many of those who have it or have access to it can't afford it. So cost is another significant barrier. This is nothing new, but again, this became a compounding factor during the pandemic. And finally, in terms of challenges that tribal communities face during the pandemic relating to broadband, those who are in rural areas possibly spread thinly across wide areas of reservation land and possibly even off reservation land. Those thinly dispersed rural or remote locations are even more difficult to plan for, to budget, and to deliver. So those who need access the most too often are those who have the least. So these are the challenges. In the middle of the pandemic, while it has been a historic tragedy with millions of people killed, many of whom were in tribal communities, nonetheless, there was a silver lining. There has been a silver lining in the cloud. And that silver lining is that despite those challenges, which have been compounded by the emergency, tribal communities have now begun during the pandemic to acquire and implement broadband networks in their communities. And this is escalating right now. And that's the reason, as Dorothy was saying, that we chose the topic that we did to focus on contracting and other legal considerations so that the tribes can get it right. If we could, Gail, go to the next slide, please. So this is a big picture artist's rendering brought to us by NTIA. We'll be hearing more about NTIA in just a moment when we get to talking about funding. On the left, in this pictorial, you'll see a community. And across that community, you have different types of technology being used to create a single, cohesive broadband network. You'll see a wireless radio tower on the left-hand side. You've seen many of these, I'm sure, possibly in your own community, up and down highways. And essentially, there is wireless transmitting and receiving equipment that is installed on these towers. The towers are high, so they can see far and carry the signal further. Wireless operators, Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile, and local ISPs, internet service providers, will use these towers to get wireless service into and out of and across tribal communities. And that's happening increasingly since the pandemic began. Another is fiber optic. I'm sure you've seen roads being dug up with trenches, and fiber is being, in many cases, laid into those trenches to bring very high-speed broadband service to both households and to businesses and governmental institutions. Fiber is, generally speaking, the preferred tool, if you can afford it, to get broadband connectivity. But the more dispersed the population is, the less economic sense it makes. So that's where you get wireless being combined with fiber. And in the most extreme cases, when you have very remote areas with the thinly dispersed population, you have satellite, which doesn't appear in this pictorial. That satellite is above this picture in space, providing a footprint of coverage that goes all the way across the community and even beyond the community, providing yet another type of connectivity or broadband. So you have multiple technologies. Which one is chosen by a community will depend on many factors. How many people, what types of services have been prioritized by the tribal leadership? What's already there? Where are the gaps? What types of gaps are they? What is the geography? What is the demography? What are income levels looking like? What are the standards of health, education, availability of jobs? Do you want vocational training? There are 100 questions that get asked initially to begin planning out these networks. And at the end of the day, the tribal community, having communicated what their priorities are, can leverage these networks to address basically anything that is of most importance to them. And if we look at the right side of this slide, these are the types of things that we typically see being so important for tribal communities. And no surprise, really, it's telemedicine, health, telehealth for higher standards of health care in tribal communities. This is not everywhere, but often a very high priority. Education, likewise, as we were saying, not only for access to educational content and curriculum for the students, but teacher training. So a lot of these teachers are in remote areas, and they need to be continuously improved in their ability to teach. Not having that type of tool is often frustrating, and you get churn where teachers in remote areas want to move and leave, and then you have a gap in the remote areas for education. So having a distance learning or remote learning capability and teacher training is often another of the high priorities that we see among tribal communities. Jobs, being able to get to work even when you're situated remotely. Also being able to improve your skills as a worker through vocational training remotely. This is another capability that has become very important, especially so during the pandemic in tribal communities. Out in the West and in California, water, I'm sure I don't need to say it, but I will. Access to water, knowing how much water is flowing to and through a tribal community, and then being able to budget that water. And if there's an excess, does the tribe want to capitalize on that excess availability in some way? All of these things can be enabled by a broadband network using a variety of techniques and technology tools. It's being done right now. It's not experimental. These new technologies are financially approachable. And this is another area of high priority that we're seeing among the California tribal communities. The list goes on. During the pandemic, government, tribal leadership has had difficulty staying in contact with their own people, where they can communicate to their own people what is being done, asking them, what are your priorities and needs? How can we be more responsive? Having participation in tribal council meetings remotely. These sorts of things, which are basic, are too often unavailable, but completely achievable with a broadband network. So I won't belabor this point except to say that almost any objective that is socio-economic in nature, even cultural, can be achieved using a broadband network. And let me just say one more thing. One of the tribes that we've worked with in California, and I'm touching on cultural priorities, they have one of the richest availabilities of ancient petroglyphs from their ancestors anywhere in the world, not just in the state of California or in the United States, but anywhere in the world. And there have been people who have come in and trespassed in these ancestral sacred places, and in some cases have defaced or even stolen the petroglyphs. Broadband networks have a capability for remote monitoring, among other things. There are a wide range of ways that these networks can be leveraged to achieve very unique tribal priorities. Let me say one more, and then I'll move on. Another need that we have encountered during the pandemic is language. language revitalization. We have met with and provided some assistance for tribes where elders who are among the only fluent speakers of the traditional language of that tribe have been dying at an alarming rate due to COVID. So the cultural assets, the heritage of the tribe is at risk. A broadband network can be used for language training. It can be used through providing games to incentivize very young people to engage the language in innovative ways. And there are a wide range of these tools and services that are available for those tribes who are facing this type of challenge, among any others. So we'll maybe talk about some of the other priorities and challenges that we're seeing that can be satisfied with broadband, but I don't want to go on too long. I probably already have. So does anyone want to ask any questions or say anything about any element of this slide before we move on?
I just, am I muted? I just wanted to reinforce that, you know, during COVID, we have worked with a couple of tribes that are general council tribes, meaning the general council, the whole tribe, makes decisions for that tribe on, and it was impossible to convene a general council meeting during COVID, and it really crippled the tribal government in just carrying out, you know, decisions that had to be made that affected the tribe, because there was no way to convene one of those meetings. And one of these tribes has really moved forward with broadband, and what their goal is to start holding virtual general council meetings to have people that are living off the reservation be able to now participate regularly in general council meetings. So we were really excited about that. And like I said, during COVID, it really drove home the crippling, like I said, of the tribe's ability to conduct just even tribal business. So with that, I'll be quiet.
So Dorothy, could I just add to that and say that there are clearly many reasons why it's so important for tribal government to have a clear and transparent dialogue with their own people, particularly during an emergency, you know, a long-running emergency. Now we have the Delta variant surging through communities, so we don't know when this is going to end. It's really important for all government priorities, but specific to the broadband network, what we're beginning to talk about here on this webinar, everything that happens in applying for grants, receiving the funds, applying the funds, that entire process really requires a high level of transparency between tribal leadership and the community. And the broadband network itself becomes that mechanism that can be used to provide assurances for that transparency. So this is, you know, the broadband network and the entire enterprise around that becomes one of many things that is enabled through that clear discourse between local government and the community.
David, we have one question, and any of you can answer this. It doesn't have to be you, David, but it says, so you recommend to go with more than one broadband approach, ? Fiber, cellular, and satellite?
Gail, would you like to go or should I?
I think we probably both will say the same thing, so I'm happy for you to take it. I know my answer would be that's part of the assessment of what's the best way to deliver broadband, and the answer is going to be different in every community.
That's right. Essentially, it will be any one of a number of permutations. Again, it depends. One of the first things that we do when we work with a community is we do a landscape analysis. We go into the community if we can. If we can't go in, then we speak with community leadership to understand what systems and services are already there. And we try to understand how satisfactory are the systems and services that are already there, and what type of systems and services are they. Then we speak with the community and the leadership, and we come to an understanding. We call that mapping, by the way. We map the community to find out what is already there, where is everybody who is not receiving access, where is there perhaps access but no adoption for whatever reason. That might be because it's not affordable. It might be because the quality of service is so bad that nobody sees the point. It could be a lack of familiarity with the technology, and nobody ever took the trouble to conduct training, digital skills, as it's called. So we do that mapping exercise. Then we talk to the community about what their priorities are. What challenges do they want to address? What new opportunities do they see that have not yet been realized that are part of the strategic vision for that tribe? And that's where we were talking about water, agriculture, tourism, protecting cultural sites, and e-governance, having a linkage between government and the tribal population, education, health, et cetera, et cetera. We understand what do they want, how do they want to use the network, and then we can say, all right, based on what we see and is already there and what is not there, we can design a network. And what tools are used will depend on how many people, what types of services, what type of geography, what type of weather even has something to say about it. And a variety of other factors will be considered. And then a network design and plan will be written up, and a budget will be established on how much that would cost. You have to look at other very fundamental things like who is going to actually acquire this, who's going to own it, who's going to run it. Is it going to be an organization that is already operating around or in the tribe? Is it a tribal organization? Is it non-tribal? Is it multiple organizations? It could be multiple service providers. So there are many considerations that we look at together with the communities to come up with what is the optimal approach and which are the best technologies so that the community can achieve the objectives they want to see realized. And then there's also, what can you afford? That's a big one. And the answer to that question has changed. And that's one of the main reasons we're having this webinar, because the money angle has shifted significantly, and we'll be getting into that in just a moment. Any further comments or questions? Okay, the money angle, here we go. Before we address these specific U.S. government agencies, each of which has a fund that tribes are eligible to apply for grants for broadband acquisitions. Before we go into these four, these are just examples. Let me take a step back. When we first began working with tribes last year during the pandemic, together with our partners, we did an assessment of every U.S. government agency that had funds that tribes were eligible for. Now, this was not specific only to broadband, it was for everything. COVID relief money from all the federal agencies and state agencies of the US government, the total was something like $70 billion that was available for tribes to use in some way. A significant portion of that was eligible for acquisitions by tribes was broadband. Now, that was last year. This year, the numbers have increased. These are a sampling of some of the funds that are available to be applied for right now. And I've mentioned a couple times the work that we're doing with tribes in California. Tribes are scrambling right now to take advantage of these funds, these and other funds. And we have been working with tribes to help them write grant applications. An example is in the state of California, the California Public Utilities Commission, CPUC, has had grants since last year that can be applied for tribes, by tribes, for things like contracting a firm to conduct a feasibility study. The last question we were just discussing, that was a feasibility study. Understanding what the priorities are, what is and is not there already, and then building a study and a plan and a business plan around that. That feeds into the grant application process. And that's applicable in all of these. One of the ones that's moving most quickly is in the upper left-hand corner here, and it's the NTIA Tribal Broadband Connectivity Program. Grant applications are being written right now, all among many tribes throughout California, and indeed all of the reservations where there are federally recognized tribes. It's almost $1 billion, and it is specifically a tribal broadband fund. Each tribe is eligible for a minimum of $500,000, and it goes up from there, depending on the needs and the size and other criteria associated with that tribe. At the heart of what NTIA wants to see in these applications is how tribes plan to acquire broadband systems and services that will help to strengthen health, education, and work, especially. And they want to see account taken of what measures will be taken, what measures are being planned by the tribe to ensure for adoption of the services that are enabled through the network. And will there be training? There should be training for digital inclusion and other forms of service that are crucial for adoption. So the deadline on this is coming up very quickly. We only have a few weeks. September 1st is the last day by which these applications can be submitted. We are part of a larger partnership that is working with tribes to crank quickly grant applications as quickly as possible for that particular fund. And there are others. You'll see across here, the state of California, just a week or so ago, held an event online all day with workshops where they explained for California tribes a $2 billion fund that the state is making available. This is about last mile, that is broadband that goes all the way out to residents and individuals to connect homes as well as businesses with newly acquired networks or networks that have been expanded using the allocation. The FCC, that's the Federal Communications Commission, has an emergency broadband benefit program, $3.2 billion. No deadline that we're aware of just yet. We're watching that, tracking it. That provides for up to $75 a month for households on tribal lands. The Department of Treasury has a COVID capital projects fund. Deadline, end of the calendar year, $10 billion. And that's for COVID response, addressing public health, economic challenges in tribal communities. So it's quite broad and exciting. Let me say too that on Sunday evening, you all may have seen that in Congress, there was an agreement reached between the two political parties for yet another. This is the infrastructure bill. And this one is huge. It's roughly $1 trillion. And in that bill, there is, I'd have to double check this, but by recollection, it's something like $65 billion provided for broadband infrastructure. And that's not all. There are other funds, and some of these become even more specific. Example, you may see funds from the Department of Agriculture, where if your tribe has identified improvement of agricultural concerns in your reservation, there could be very specific agriculture-related funds that could be leveraged together with broadband-related funds that you've derived from another of these NTIA or FCC or Department of Treasury or what have you. So there's a large number of options that are available for tribes right now that are huge and represent an unprecedented and historic opportunity for tribes to take greater control over their own destinies using broadband networks and strengthening the types of services that are important to them, some of which we've already discussed. I'm going to stop there for the moment. Gail, did I miss any key points, do you think?
No, I would just emphasize that the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program, that's available right now. And one of the challenges, I think, in communities where you don't have very robust broadband access is getting on, finding, signing up, and getting that benefit. And that benefit is really a personal benefit to the subscriber to the service. These other funds and these other pools of funding are really looking, so it's sort of, that's why it's called emergency. It's sort of fill the gap right now. If you've got service and you can't pay for it, here's a way to help pay for it. The other programs are looking long-term to improve the availability of the services themselves and and the education to help spur adoption, so people will know and understand what kind of benefit they can get from broadband and have more people sign up for it. So that's the one thing I just wanted to emphasize, is that emergency broadband benefit. It's available today to the extent you have broadband access already.
Just a quick question about that benefit, if you could go one slide back.
Oh.
Is that, just to clarify, is that for tribes to apply to and then disperse to eligible households, or is that for households to apply on their own in some way?
So it was created with the idea that who's paying the bill signs up, and so the amount that's shown is $75 per month for households on tribal lands. I think you would have to look at, and I haven't looked at it from this perspective, how a particular tribe contracted for the broadband services or is paying for it, and how you would fill out the forms to ensure that it's covered. But you have to, the benefit is, was thinking more of the regular public in mind, where you live in a house, you sign up on your own, you choose your provider, and you get a benefit if you qualify. So I'm sure that the forms would address that, or the FCC will have contact people that can help with if your contracting is a little bit different than the typical individual subscriber contracting.
Gail, I would just like to add a couple points before we move on to the next slide. I realize the sand is running quickly through the hourglass here. 3 points very quickly. One, we're talking about feasibility studies, mapping, identifying needs, and so on in preparation for design and ultimately procurement of networks, broadband networks. Each of these funds will have different values associated with scoring criteria. And what is discovered during these feasibility studies can answer those questions so that the grant applications can be written in a way that will result in a more successful outcome. Secondly, I mentioned multiple funds at the same time that could be leveraged. If that is an option that the tribal community wants to pursue, one caution, and I'm sure probably everybody on this call knows this already, but I just want to say it to be sure, deconflicting the way that the different funds are used is really important. You don't want to have overlapping use across multiple funds. The agencies will not want to see that, and they may see it if that happens. They may see it because a lot of these funds, maybe all of them, require monitoring and compliance to ensure conformity with the criteria that have been set out by that agency for that fund. Monitoring and compliance is highly detailed work. We could probably do an entire webinar just on M&C, and maybe we shall. But I wanted to flag those because they're really important things to consider around these funds. Gail, you want to get us on to the next stage of the discussion?
I think this is also your slide if you want it, David.
Yeah, you feel free to jump in too, Gail.
Sure.
I know that you have a much deeper bench of experience than we do on this, but these are a few items that we see worldwide when we're working with communities, not just tribes, but all forms of communities in the contracting space. And we've seen really, really serious mistakes made that disadvantage the community, sometimes tribal, sometimes not, because they didn't get it right in the contract on things like jurisdiction, whose law governs and why, arbitration clauses. Telco contracts often are subject to a state law and the courts in that state. Having an arbitration clause can provide greater leverage for a community that might otherwise be put at a disadvantage. Dates. We did see some contracts recently in the tribal community here in California where there was no date. There was no end date on the contract. So it left wide open what the service provider could do for that tribe. And that could have potentially put them at a disadvantage. SLA is a term you'll hear around contracting activity, and Gail is going to provide us with more detail on how to get it right on an SLA. This is a service level agreement, and this is something that describes what you, the tribal community, insist upon in terms of the performance of your network, the way it's provided. So it could, and there are various measures that can be put into the service level agreement. And by signing that SLA, the system or service provider that you've contracted is signing up to a guarantee that they will deliver X. That could be a certain level of reliability in the performance of the network. It could be quality of service. Are you getting a very high level of throughput coming through the network for broadband, for very broad broadband, and so forth. There are a number of measures that can be put in there. And in some cases, if they get it wrong, they have to fix it. You specify in the SLA how quickly they have to fix it. And if they don't, there can actually be financial penalties. This is protection. This is armor for the community to strengthen their position relative to the system and service provider. Pricing. It's worth asking for pricing not to exceed an agreed level. And one thing to note about broadband networks is you never have as much as you want in terms of throughput. There's always going to be more demand for faster throughput in the network. And technology will change, adaptations in software, other aspects of the technology evolve and improve, and your network needs to be designed in a way where it can be adapted and improved and evolve over time. And your contracting should allow for that and protect that. The same is true on scale of bandwidth. You will want to scale up the bandwidth. You don't want to be locked into a contract with a very limited amount. That's going to be a problem that will be realized sooner rather than later if it's not accounted for in the contracting. Gail, any points that you think should be highlighted here?
Yeah, certainly. So just to give you sort of a benchmark to compare to when we're talking about these terms here, in a normal situation, if you're just a homeowner and you subscribe to internet service from Comcast or Charter Spectrum or some other wireless provider or wireless internet service provider or landline provider, typically, if you spend the time to sort of read the detail of the consumer contract, there are almost no commitments there. It's when you buy a certain speed of internet, it's an up to commitment. So they never promise you they will deliver that, but you will get up to that. They will never give you faster speed than you sign up for without you paying more, but they don't guarantee you will get that commitment, even that speed. And they manage their networks and ensure they've got multiple users. So sometimes you experience when all the kids come home from school at 3 or 3:30 pre-COVID, suddenly you would see your internet slows down. Another thing is with the price. You don't negotiate the price. You're a consumer. You see what's available, and it's sort of a take it or leave it. This is a very different situation when you have the funding and you're constructing or procuring a network. You can control all of those sorts of things. What level of service you're getting, the quality of service, and the pricing. This can be very profitable service model once, especially a fiber network. Once it's in, it doesn't require a lot of maintenance. It can be highly profitable for the owner. Ownership is also a very important issue to think about. So you can negotiate discounts. It's not like procuring service in the normal environment. When you have the funding and you're constructing the network, you have a lot more ability to control the terms. So that's the way to get the best deal really is through a good, robust procurement process, which I think is our next slide. No, it's back to David, talking a little bit more about technologies.
Fine. Leave it there, but I wanted to add to your final point there, which is such a good point for everyone who's listening. In terms of negotiating on price, I would underscore everything that Gail just said. And in addition, you can even improve the negotiating position further through bringing multiple reservations together, aggregating the demand from across all of those reservations, and then leveraging that in a negotiation through a collective bargaining process. And let me just say, the NTIA grant, the Notice of Funding Opportunity, the NOFO, as it's called, it specifically references an interest on the part of NTIA in seeing applications that take account of that sort of arrangement where tribes or reservations are coordinating with each other to get efficiencies, and in the process also getting collective bargaining power in the negotiating process. Let's see. So here's a few other considerations. We're not going to have time to get into all of these, and there's still others that are really important, but we just wanted to flag them as examples. Whose software is running the network? Are you protected? Is it your software or somebody else's? What's happening to your data? Data is money. Some of the biggest high-tech companies in the world are providing free services that millions, if not billions of people are using. And the way that that big tech company makes its money is by selling data, your data. potentially. So that's a key question, is what's flowing through that network in terms of data? How do you ensure that you have sovereignty over that data? And there are some types of data where it may be okay to have it in the open, but almost surely there's going to be other types of data where you want to protect it. And there are ways to do that and build that into your network design. And that then will ultimately be reflected in contracts often. Whose hardware? Real quick, I just want to say there's a lot of Chinese made equipment out there. The US government has already begun to place prohibitions on the use of certain types of Chinese equipment. Those requirements may become even more stringent. So it's important to know, is there Chinese equipment that's being offered to the tribal community? If so, you need to have provision made. Either don't buy it, or if you do, make sure that you're protected contractually. Another question, we mentioned this earlier in the conversation, who's going to run that network? If it's not the tribe itself, then a good IT company is going to need to be identified, and there's going to need to be a contract there that is bulletproof. We just talked about tribal data. I'm going to skip that. Hacking or attacks is really a big deal. Some of the most vulnerable communities in the world are at the top of the list as targets for cyber attacks. So vulnerabilities need to be understood, and that has something to say about the way that contracts and service level agreements are written. And final note, and then I'm going to be quiet on this slide, is what is broadband? The definition varies, but in the US, the Federal Communication Commission defines broadband as 25 megabits down and 3 megabits up. We call it 25/3. That is a minimum baseline, a lowest common denominator of broadband. And when a contract is written, you will need to define how you define broadband from a contractual standpoint. And we would encourage more robust definitions of broadband that go beyond 25/3. You're going to want a lot more than that. And I'll leave it at that. Gail, anything to add here?
Yeah, absolutely. On the broadband, that is, you really should see that minimum that the FCC came up with as kind of more of a political statement than a useful benchmark. One of the most important benefits you can get when you are negotiating terms or you are procuring your own network and setting your own terms for your service level is to have what we call a symmetrical connection. So the download speed, the speed coming to your house, and the upload, the speed that you can send data out to the world, is symmetrical. So instead of 25/3, it would be 25/25, or ideally 100/100, 500/500. That allows for those really intensive video uses that to work properly, especially telehealth. It's kind of critical to have much better both download and upload speeds to be able to usefully take advantage of those sorts of important benefits of having a broadband network. I think I should go on to the next slide, maybe, because I see we're coming close to the hour, and I just wanted to check in if we had any questions and if we were able to go a little bit over the time.
Let's get on to do you see any questions?
I'll defer to Mike on that, but I think we are scheduled to go to about 1:15. So.
Oh, perfect. Okay,
yeah,
my
I think
mistake.
we might be putting it to question time, but please.
Okay, I'll continue then. I'll go. So a lot of this has been covered already. I won't belabor some of these points David made much more eloquently than I could probably. But in terms of the steps in broadband planning, again, we're trying to emphasize the importance of investigating your options, setting a general direction, and deciding what works best for you. Don't be just receiving proposals, unsolicited offers, and taking those as all that's out there. This is where a chance for you to really drill down on what you have available in your community, what you want to achieve with your broadband service or your broadband network. And that's why one of the things, this is new to a lot of communities, sort of setting their own path and having their own, being able to make these decisions. And so it is important also to stay flexible and recognize that you're going to learn more as you go through a process. And you can use different approaches depending on sort of your timeline for spending the funds that you receive. Request for information is one method that can be used, where you ask interested service providers to provide information that on what they might be able to do for your community to help inform your planning. So you can do your own due diligence, your own investigation, but you can also put out a request for information and try to seek some of that information from service providers that may be interested in serving your community. A request for proposal is more formal, and that is where you would actually be asking, do you have a potential project in mind? You're requesting bids from service providers and contractors for that project. You can have flexibility in there. There's a lot of ways that RFPs get drafted. One caution I would have is not to be careful about who helps you prepare the RFP, and make sure that they have your interests in mind and not theirs in preparing a request for proposals. A request for a quote is another way where you have maybe more limited potential work or services, and you're just asking, this is what we want, what price would you pay? Or would you charge us? So those are some of the techniques that you can use, or the methods of getting more information about what the market is, what kind of services might be available, or what your projects might cost in terms of payments and timelines, right? Timelines for deploying the networks. David, did you have anything to add, or I'll move to the next slide?
Add one point on your explanation of RFPs and RFQs. I just wanted to say, Gail, you made the very important and good point that the tribal communities need to be careful about who has their hands on the pen when these are written. And I will just say that one of the things that we have seen is where a community may have a good relationship with a vendor, and that could be a provider of services or of systems, equipment, or both. And they have a relationship, and they're like, oh gosh, we need to expand the network, or we want a new network. And there's a discussion about going out with a request for proposals, and the trusted vendor will say, oh, well, I can help you write that. And then we have seen this before, where the vendor will help write it, and they will write the RFP or the RFQ in a way where the decision that is being made based on the way it's written is based on the technology that is used by the vendor. And it can be very specific criteria that are included in the RFP or the RFQ that will make it difficult or impossible for competitors to that vendor to win. So that's an example of why what Gail has said here just now is so important.
Thanks, David. I'm going to move to, unless.
Just one more question from the chat. Janice is asking, what is a recommended upload and download above 25.3?
I have in my home 180 by 80, but the standard that you hear a lot that is out there is the technology can support a gigabit. And a gigabit is a huge amount. Most people probably can't use that individually. That might not be necessary, but again, I think it will depend on what your needs are in your community. I kind of defer to David on those technical questions. I just know 25 by 3 won't get you much of anything.
You're exactly correct, Gail. The short answer to the question is it depends. Is the service for an individual? Is it for a family? How many are in the family? How do they use broadband? Do they use virtual reality, gaming? Is it not for a family? Is it for a governmental institution? Is it for a commercial for-profit enterprise? There are so many things, and this would be part of the feasibility study that would be conducted for the community. Will assess all of these and other factors in order to get at the answer to your question. It's a great question. Huge.
Yep. Okay,
Yep.
I'm going to turn to the next slide, and this is to just very briefly, I'm going to cover some of the typical deal documents or agreements that you may come across in this area, because it's somewhat unique, unique terms and unique sort of contractual arrangements. So starting with one that is more basic, a construction contract. So there may be a contract for the construction of the network. One of the things that is a little different about constructing, say, a fiber network compared to constructing a building. A building, you'll have to pass certain inspections by, building code inspections and things like that. For a fiber network, there should be some kind of a testing as well to show that what they've installed is actually going to perform the way it should. So sometimes those sorts of things get left out or aren't thought of. Also, the timelines for construction, and so you have milestones and you know when things are supposed to happen so that you don't end up in a situation where you have, you paid for a network and you're not seeing to get it. Operator agreements. That's another where, hold on, I'm getting sort of annoyed. Operator agreements are another where if that may be agreement with, you decide that you're not going to operate or hire people to operate the network within your community, and you hire a third party as an operator. You're going to expect them to perform at a certain level. You've got to deal with the costs of that operation, and ongoing maintenance and upgrades and things like that could come in an operator agreement. Fiber conduit infrastructure leases, that's another way you can acquire assets that might be available in your region through acquiring your fiber or conduit or other infrastructure that will be a part of your network. And also sometimes the flip side is you might construct a network that has excess capacity that you can lease out to third parties as a revenue source. Indefeasible right of use is a term used a lot in the telecom industry, which basically is a way, an alternative to a lease that might have a monthly or a quarterly payment. This is where you might pay for a component or a portion of a network up front for a 20-year period, and then it's like a lump sum payment. You basically, in effect, own that portion of the network, shared ownership with others, and then you pay only a maintenance fee going forward. Service level agreement, I think David spoke about quite a bit. Pole attachment agreements. If you have infrastructure in your community, you can charge for attaching fiber or antennas to that infrastructure, those utility poles or other towers. You, on the other hand, if you need to use someone else's poles, you may be entering into agreements to pay them for that use. Site leases for if they're coming to put telecommunications buildings or like cabinets, towers on your property. There may be leases to use portions of your land or rooftops of buildings. Co-location agreements, that's a type of agreement where you may have existing, say an existing room or existing building that already houses telephone equipment or other telecommunications equipment, and the network builder wants to install their equipment in that building as well, and that would be a co-location agreement. Then there are franchise and encroachment agreements. Those are granting rights to use land that's typically a little bit more linear, like down the streets or from a public street to a home owner or to a resident or to a commercial building. And then there will be other contracts related to service delivery or system maintenance. It can be a very wide-ranging set of deal documents for broadband networks. Any comments, David, or anyone else?
Well, I see we have 3 minutes, so I'll leave it to the audience if they have a question they'd like to share.
Okay. Then I will move to the next slide. Very quickly, we've covered this already, and the slides will be available after. Avoid pitfalls, clarify key terms, the timelines for your project, have checkpoints on the progress, look at the construction, maintenance, removal responsibilities, the design, aesthetics will be maybe a concern for some of the structures. The service requirements, ownership, key issue is who's going to own this network that you are funding, indemnity insurance to protect it in the event of any accidents or damage to property. Watch out for one-sided agreements. Make sure the agreement is consistent with oral and written representations. A lot of times I started commenting on this at the beginning of this presentation. A lot of times what is said in meetings does not make its way into the documents that you're being asked to sign unless you carefully review and insist on it. Unrestricted assignments or transfers of agreements. You may think you have a deal with a certain partner and the next thing you know, they've sold that off to someone else. And just be cognizant that it's important to have input from the public about aesthetics and any concerns about some of the technologies that are used. We see sometimes there are concerns about radio frequency emissions, for example, as issues to watch for.
I could just maybe add very briefly, when there is an entire network that the contract is addressing, be sure that it addresses both the hardware that is used in the network, and that would include provisions for warranties, pricing, spares, training on how to install, maintain, operate, etc. And then a service, the service itself needs to be reflected in the contract as well. And that's where we talked a little bit about that when we were talking about service level agreements. You know, you need to have metrics that are measurable that have to be upheld in terms of quality, reliability, throughput, etc. So yeah, just a quick addition there. And I think that brings us to the closing thought, which is really just a very high level summary of what we've addressed here. And that is that we're at a historic moment for tribes here right now. The opportunity, we've never seen anything like it, for tribes to really take hold of their own destinies at a new and higher level, strengthening their sovereignty with these broadband networks, using the funds that are available. The more these funds that are available, the more vendors are going to be knocking on your door. the more importance that there will be to check each of the boxes that has been set out here by Gil. Contracts that don't protect tribal interests, that actually threatens network viability and weakens sovereignty. The good side of that story is that when you get it right, leveraging best practices, many of which we've discussed here in the past few minutes, leveraging strong legal experience, you can optimize successful outcomes that have been set out by the tribal leadership, by the tribal community, as to what their aspirations are and how best to realize them using broadband networks.
Thank you. Are there any more questions? I forgot, or I failed to mention that this will be recorded and posted. Mike, do you have anything else to add about where people can get access to today's webinar?
Yes, it's as soon as we get the recording and edit to cut out some stuff in the beginning, we're going to post it to CILS's website. You'll be able to navigate to it on the website, but the URL should be calindian.org/tribal broadband. And once again, that's calindian.org/tribal broadband. There'll be a recording probably uploaded to YouTube available there. You know, I had one thought that Gil and David, if you have another minute, might be able to address, as I wonder if you know, many people attending, you know, have good relationships with services and are hearing, you know, a feasibility study sounds like, you know, obviously there's a lot of complicated things here and decision points that we want to make the right decision. But I wonder if some people are thinking, how bad could it be if we don't make the perfect decision and we make wrong? A feasibility study sounds like something, you know, that we kind of have to do before we get doing, and the timeline is short. And I was wondering if you just might respond to that. I know that you have stories of coming in after feasibility studies weren't done. And I think that might be something valuable for the attendees just to hear a little reflection on.
Yeah, sure. I mean, when you have time limitations, you have time limitations. If you really want to go for it, then it is possible to scramble and leverage whatever data you have at your disposal, to read the notice of funding opportunity from whichever agency it is and see if you can address the criteria and questions that are set out for the grant application. And good luck. Depending on the tribe, that might be doable. In our experience, and this is not unique to tribes, but we see this worldwide with communities of various types. How big is the community? How well resourced are they? They may have a fairly sophisticated IT department or communications department. They may have their own locally owned communication service provider already who gets it. They already know who isn't and isn't served. They already know what the complaints are, where the gaps are, what types of services are aspirational, and where they'd like to get to. So they could pull that off more likely. There are a lot of tribes, however, who are small. They don't have those departments. They don't own a local, tribally run communication service provider, and access to the types of information that may be needed for the grant application might be tough to come by. And getting spun up in a very short period of time could be extremely difficult. We see this all the time. And a final note, we have spent a lot of time working on networks where they got it wrong. And we have gone in and we have done analysis of all of the problems impacting the network. And we have set out a correctional plan on what's going to be needed to bring that network back into conformity with what has been written into the contract, including, hopefully, a service level agreement. We've seen it all. And I will tell you that getting a messed up network back on track is a really difficult thing to do. You don't want to go there if you can possibly avoid it. It is survivable, but it may be costly and painful. And when you have a community that is depending on that network, and you got it wrong. The community is in your face first and foremost. It can get really hot. So we would advise strongly to if you don't have an in-house capability that's legal, that is broadband savvy, that you work with partners that you trust, and that would be my answer to that question. Mike.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Well, thank you everybody for attending, and we would really like to hear from you about whether or not we might have another webinar kind of taking this to the next level and maybe getting into a little bit more detail about these service agreements and other kind of contract language. Some of the things that and questions that I have, I didn't want to take up too much time, but if people have more questions that they would like to have answered, send them on to CILS, and we can make sure that we get them onto, or get them over to Gail and David, and we could maybe host another webinar to address those. Also, if you, like I said, if you have just general questions, you can send them. My email address is right there. I have a lot of the CILS staff on this webinar, and I'll make sure and dispatch your question to the closest CILS office to your tribe or to, you know, whatever organization you're affiliated with. So anyway, I want to thank everybody again, and for our presenters. I really want to stress that this was all free. They provided their time and their energy to this. So we really, really thank you. So,
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
It's an honor to work alongside you, Dorothy.
okay, thanks.
Thank
All right,
you.
everybody, have a good day.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.